Influencing popular culture, politics, and everything in between. The local station takes you ringside as we discuss the crazy world that is professional wrestling. This is Going Ringside with the local station.
Hello there, and thank you for joining us today for another episode of Going Ringside. I'm your host, Scott Johnson. This is episode 32, if you are keeping count. So glad you could be with us today. As I've always said since the show started, please continue to spread the word about the show to any wrestling fans you may know, any online wrestling groups. We're still trying to get the word out that Going Ringside is out here. And last episode was really an important episode, one that we wanted to do because it was really timely, and that was the mass layoffs at WWE. You can go back and listen to episode 31 right now, wherever you get your podcasts, or on YouTube, as well as our home station website, news4jax.com. That was an important one because there have been so many structural changes within WWE post-merger with UFC. And now that things are changing, in that episode we talk about the possible future of Vince McMahon. Now there's been speculation that the corporation may be laying the groundwork for his eventual departure. We're still monitoring that. Some high-profile layoffs, including Matt Riddle, who's had a lot of drama in the last week or so. As video of him in a New York airport has surfaced by TMZ because there was a lot of talk about him making allegations he was sexually assaulted by a security guard or a police officer at the airport. And now there's been video released by TMZ of him belligerent, talking in the speaker at the airport. Just some more drama in that story. But Matt Riddle, one of the high-profile firings at WWE. A couple other notable names let go: Shelton Benjamin, Dolph Ziggler. We, of course, are monitoring where they go from here. So go back and check out episode 31 right now if you want to see what we talked about there. And once again, also check us out at Going Ringside on both TikTok and Instagram. We are putting exclusive content there every day. Some stuff from the podcast here, some wrestling news that we're not putting here, and you can only see there at TikTok at Going Ringside as well as Instagram. Give us a follow there. Just stuff every day with the latest developments going on in the wrestling world and what we talk about here on the podcast as well. Kind of excited about today's episode. We have two very well-known, great longtime wrestlers. One, a ring legend in Kevin Sullivan, retired now, but did a lot through the 1970s all the way through the 1990s, doing wrestling here in Florida, and then eventually on to World Championship Wrestling, where he was a fixture for so many years. We're also talking to Bobby Fish, a guy still at the top of his game. He's been in NXT, he's been Ring of Honor, he's been AEW. He's working the independent circuit right now. Bobby Fish, a nationally, globally known name, been doing a lot for many years, and we'll get to him later on the show. But I want to start with Kevin Sullivan. The Master of Darkness was kind of his character. Lord of Darkness was kind of his character. Before The Undertaker, I don't know if you remember The Undertaker in the late 1990s, when he started his Ministry of Darkness, and he was this hooded, shrouded, almost demonic character. Well, he wasn't the first to do that. Kevin Sullivan really was doing that a lot. So let's talk about Kevin Sullivan. So Kevin Sullivan started his career in the 70s. Not as well known through the duration of the 1970s, working the territory system, doing a lot in Florida and Georgia Championship Wrestling throughout the NWA. But he really started to make his name here in Florida, in Championship Wrestling of Florida, which is where guys like Dusty Rhodes were, of course, well known, and Eddie Graham. So he adopts this character called the Prince of Darkness. Kind of a cult leader. Think Undertaker in Ministry of Darkness. Think Bray Wyatt back when he was doing the Wyatt family. Kevin Sullivan was kind of doing that back in the day. Had a lot of guys he worked with there. He feuded with Dusty Rhodes, Barry Windham, and he had guys like Bob Roop and Luna Vachon, Maniac Mark Lewin. And I had to kind of look this up because I didn't know a lot about his independent days. I'd seen seen rumblings of it on the internet, on like classic wrestling sites for years, but I wasn't watching championship wrestling from Florida, but I was noticing Kevin Sullivan in the 1980s when he eventually went to Jim Crockett Promotions, early WCW, NWA, the stuff you would watch on WTBS each week, and that's when Sullivan really started to become nationally known. And eventually he got away from the kind of occult leader gimmick and started something new. He started the Varsity Club with two up-and-coming wrestlers at the time who obviously stuck around a long time and became very well-known. Rick Steiner, as he was brand new, and Mike Rotunda. Rick Steiner went to University of Michigan. Mike Rotunda went to Syracuse. Kevin Sullivan had a college pedigree. So they started this very successful stable called the Varsity Club. Sullivan was kind of a pseudo-manager, third wrestler in the group, and they would capture the tag team titles. They were a very good stable for a while. Sullivan would be there, and he helped really bring Rick Steiner and Mike Rotunda into kind of the mainstream wrestling consciousness. Eventually, Rick Steiner went on to, bring in his brother Scott. They started the Steiner Brothers. Mike Rotunda had been kind of back and forth. He was related to Barry Windham and eventually did go over to WWF and became IRS later on. But this is really when those two guys, alongside Sullivan, really got known by a national audience. Eventually, he kind of adopted kind of the cult gimmick again, feuding when after Varsity Club broke up. He had guys like Cactus Jack, Buzz Sawyer, I think Bam Bam Bigelow for a while, feuding with them, and then eventually he left World Championship Wrestling, only to return in a very high-profile gimmick in the mid-1990s to the end of the Nitro era. So Kevin Sullivan comes back and starts what a lot of wrestling fans look back at as one of the hokiest stables of all time. I actually liked him. He was kind of the founder of the Dungeon of Doom. So the Dungeon of Doom was essentially the stable that feuded with Hulk Hogan. And Macho Man Randy Savage. So when Hulk Hogan came to WCW for the first time and really put WCW on the map as a competitor of WWF at the time, now WWE, Hulk Hogan needed monsters to feud with. Now, if you remember Hulk Hogan in the late 1980s, who was Hulk Hogan best at feuding with? He was good at feuding with monsters, larger-than-life characters who were just 400-plus pound guys. Think King Kong Bundy, think Andre the Giant, think Big John Studd, Earthquake, one-man gang. That's kind of who Hulk Hogan had been conditioned to feud with. He would come and he would take on the big monster. He'd always pretend like he was going to press him above his head. So essentially, Kevin Sullivan, through the booking there, kind of developed this stable of these monsters for Hulk Hogan to feud with. He brings in a version of the one-man gang. He brings in Earthquake. John Tenta calls him Shark because they couldn't keep the Earthquake gimmick, and they had some other gimmicks for him that were similar to his old Earthquake gimmick. Brings in Hulk Hogan's running buddy, and Brutus Beefcake calls him the Booty Man, and some other hokey gimmicks, Zodiac. We're going to talk to Brutus in an upcoming episode about that. And they had a very large stable. Kamala was brought in, Barbarian, Ming. They were the faces of fear. The Yeti, if you remember, was this hokey gimmick. When you think the sites like Wrestle Crap, a lot of it was the Dungeon of Doom. And Kevin Sullivan was kind of the leader of the faction. Now, I talked to Kevin about the Dungeon of Doom. He acknowledges that a lot of people make Dungeon of Doom, make jokes about the Dungeon of Doom. But he also said they were very successful because essentially they were a nemesis for Hulk Hogan. And as much as people give Hulk Hogan a hard time, particularly in WCW, he was the reason people were tuning in. People were bringing home paychecks because viewers were tuning in to watch Hulk Hogan. We talked to Kevin a lot about it in this interview coming up. So that was one of his big moments. In fact, there's a clip, I should have pulled it and I didn't, of him on Baywatch. Back when Hulkster and Macho Man did a guest spot on Baywatch with Pamela Anderson. Well, Kevin Sullivan comes on the show with Ric Flair and Vader, and Kevin Sullivan is on that episode of Baywatch. So as things change, because the NWO is eventually brought in, as we know, very famously, Hulk Hogan eventually left his feud with the Dungeon of Doom when Hall and Nash showed up, and he became the third man in the NWO. And once the NWO, Hall and Nash, and the New World Order and Bischoff took over, the company changed. The Dungeon of Doom was essentially put out to pasture. They weren't needed anymore because the main stable that everyone in the wrestling world was talking about was the NWO. So what's Kevin Sullivan left to do? He starts some other feuds, and one is an interesting feud that has had the wrestling world talking for 30 years because it involved Chris and eventually Nancy Benoit. In the mid-1980s, Kevin Sullivan married a younger woman named Nancy Toffolini, and they were married for a while. And eventually, by the mid-1990s, when Chris Benoit was part of the Four Horsemen with Flair and Arn Anderson and the NWO showed up, they started this feud between Sullivan, and they kind of broke kayfabe a little, broke down the wall and showed that Sullivan and Nancy, eventually Benoit, had a relationship. And they started this feud on camera where Kevin and Chris were feuding, and they made it appear like Nancy was having an affair with Chris and leaving Kevin. And then in real life, that did happen. Nancy Sullivan divorced Kevin and eventually married Chris Benoit. And a lot of people for years have said Kevin Sullivan, quote, booked his own divorce. They started this storyline about kind of a love triangle with him, Nancy, his wife, and Chris Benoit. But in real life, he gets divorced to Nancy, and Nancy remarries Chris Benoit in real life. So people have said Kevin booked his own divorce. So I asked Kevin about that because I wanted to kind of set the record straight because it's been internet lore for all these decades. You'll want to hear what he says about that angle. Of course, Nancy Benoit and Chris Benoit are a famous episode of a famous instance, and I should have had it ready for you right now. We covered the Chris Benoit murder-suicide ongoing Ringside a few months ago, and I want to get you the episode number ready, episode 11. If you want to know all about the Chris and Nancy Benoit murder-suicide, go watch episode 11 of Going Ringside right now. Sorry, I didn't have that number ready for you when we started the show here. But I asked him about that because the murder-suicide probably happened about a decade after he divorced Nancy. And I asked him, and I get his thoughts on one of the most tragic, maybe the most tragic incident in wrestling history, and that was when, in 2007, very, very famously, Chris Benoit killed Nancy and their 7-year-old son, Daniel, and then took his own life. It was probably the biggest tragedy in pro wrestling history. Wanted to get Kevin's perspective. Kevin had been divorced from Nancy for 10 years at this point. They had, very much apart, but, obviously he had been married to her, and there had been talk that he booked his own divorce. So you want to listen to what Kevin has to say about that very sensitive subject in the wrestling world. But Kevin Sullivan, and then he's kind of in retirement now. I met up with him here in Florida at the River City Wrestling Con event earlier this summer. That's where we talked, and Kevin's been kind of enjoying retirement, lives in the Northwest. I believe he started a podcast that he's been doing, and we'll talk about that a little after the interview with Kevin. But here's our interview with Kevin Sullivan, longtime wrestler, longtime promoter, longtime backstage hand, about his life in the business, about his time with the Varsity Club, about his time feuding with Hulk Hogan, the Chris and Nancy Benoit issues. Here's our interview with Kevin Sullivan. Well, we are overjoyed to be joined here by Kevin Sullivan, legendary wrestler, promoter, backstage, and everything, Kevin.
Well, thank you, Scott. It's great to be here. And this is probably the premier Comic-Con or RiverCon or whatever you want to call it. But this is the biggest event of the year. And you can see, you were here yesterday, how many people came through. They have matches today. They had matches yesterday. It's a spectacular event.
So what have you been doing with your life lately?
Well, when I kind of stopped wrestling, I opened the largest gym in the Florida Keys in Tavernier, but that's like saying you're the most popular guy in prison, because when I opened the gym, there was no chains.
Okay.
So I was the biggest gym there. And I ended up selling it after 10 years. And then I sold the house, and my wife's family's from the Pacific Northwest. So I ended up going to San Juan Islands, north of Seattle.
How did you start in the business? It was a long time ago.
Yeah, I wasn't trained. I had wrestled amateur for 10 years. And I used to wrestle this guy. Great story. He was from the DeBerry family in South Africa, the Diamond people. And he went to Oxford and Harvard Business School. And he did some male modeling for those Arrow shirts back in the day.
Yeah.
And he did soap operas. But all he wanted to do was be a pro wrestler. But it was beneath the station where he was in South Africa.
Yeah.
So he had wrestled for back in the day in independents, small areas, and professionally. And he was a very good amateur wrestler. And he said to me, "Would you like to try it?" I said, "Sure, I'm not doing anything. I'll give it a shot." And I went up there and I had my first match in Montreal.
How did your national break come? When did you start going national?
Well, I got kind of recognition when I came to Florida, and then I was on the first wave of TBS that went nationwide.
Back in the early to mid 80s?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
so you were down here in Florida with Dusty and people like that?
Yeah, I wrestled Dusty quite a bit. I wrestled Blackjack. I wrestled the great Barry Windham, who's here today. And I wrestled Andre the Giant. So I had a very...
What was it like? You're not a big guy. You and Andre. What was that like?
It was great. I mean, I was 252 pounds at the time. I had been a power lifter and a bodybuilder. But he was a very nice guy to me. And it was amazing. People don't understand how big he is. I just saw something on YouTube where somewhere the WWE, I think they do it at WrestleMania, they bring this thing is put your hand next to Andre's.
Yeah.
Well, Brock Lesnar is a big guy.
Yeah.
And he put his hand next to Andre's. He looked like a child. That's how big the guy was.
Any good Dusty stories back in the day?
Oh, Dusty was probably the premier at the time that he went to New York and was wrestling superstar Billy Graham. Between him and Billy Graham, they were the biggest 1-2 attractions in the world. And Dusty was a fabulous performer, great mind, a genius, if you will.
Yeah.
You know, he was an amazing athlete.
So eventually you start doing the dark, demonic, satanic gimmick.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
Well, MTV had just started.
Yeah.
Billy Idol, White Wedding, Thriller with Michael Jackson. The horror genre came full circle. And then they were showing old movies of all the horror movies back in the day. So I just would sit there and watch them, and I write stuff down and incorporate my own stuff. And then I had been in the East. I was in Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, Thailand, and I would get out and go look at things. And I went to cave temples and met some seafoods, and I said, I can incorporate this in some...
I think one of your areas where I think you really broke out nationally was the Varsity Club.
Yeah.
With Rotunda and Rick Steiner. How did that come about? Was it because of your background, amateur?
No, it was Dusty's idea. If you remember back then, there was some scandals in the college. You remember there was a lot of stuff going on back in the day. And when you saw that, you saw two clean-cut collegiate athletes at the top of the game, and then you see this crazed individual with a black robe on.
Yeah.
Well, you know, they weren't hanging out to listen to him or to Tate. So it was a subliminal message. That's what Dusty was very good at.
And so you do, throughout the WCW's glory days.
Right.
You're there. You do Varsity Club, and then they knock it, but you were over as the Dungeon of Doom, being kind of Hulk Hogan's foil.
Well, the reason why I was writing the show at the time, the reason why I did the Dungeon of Doom was Hogan brought in his friends, and the wrestling business was really changing. It was getting more real.
Yeah.
And the wrestling was coming back, the technical wrestling, and it wasn't that these guys weren't capable of doing it that were in the Dungeon of Doom, because I had Ming, I had Barbarian,
yeah.
I had Conan, I had a lot of fabulous wrestlers, but I knew I had to get them on the show, so I lumped them all together so I could almost give it some kind of comical relief, and that was what Hogan had thrived on WWF at the time. It was big monsters, and I just made it a little bit more hokey.
What was Hogan like to work with then?
It was fabulous. I mean, I used to say to my kids, when you say your prayers tonight, make sure you thank Hulk Hogan for the way you live.
Because he was bringing in the checks.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of knocks on Hogan during this time, because he's the top guy, so everyone's going to knock him.
Yeah.
But he's the reason why you guys are essentially paying your bills.
Yeah, and the other thing is, I get a kick out of it. The young guys then were saying, oh, the old guys hogging the spotlight, you can't get up. Those same guys are older guys now.
Yeah.
And they're on top.
Yeah.
Right? So you get a different perspective as you get older.
One guy you mentioned I want to ask about, Ming, Haku. Is he as tough as everyone says? It's lore among wrestling fans.
Well, I saw two incidents in my life. Haku didn't drink.
Okay.
But when he drank, it was a whole Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. And back in the day when we would go to Louisiana and we'd go out into some of the counties, you could only buy beer at bars and take it out, right? There was no package stores.
Yeah.
So I had me, I believe, Bobby Eaton, a couple of other guys in the car, but Ming was in the car. So I pulled up and I said, I'll go in and get the beer. When I walked in, by the time I got to go get the beer, I look over my peripheral vision, and Ming's got a triple Jack Daniels, and he swallows it.
Uh-oh. That's a dangerous thing.
So then he goes to play pool. And there was a bunch of rednecks.
Yeah.
One of them had a flannel shirt with the sleeves cut off, and he said a real derogatory statement to him.
Okay.
He said, we don't let people of your background
Okay.
play pool. So he said, I'm playing pool. So when Ming grabbed the pool stick, guy came up and hit him in the back with the pool stick, and they splintered. And when Ming turned around, you know the hole he used to use on TV, the goozle?
Yeah.
That's real. When he got the guy in the throat, I thought it was like a wrestling match. The guy started to drop. Ming bit through his shirt and spit a piece of his back out.
Oh, my God.
Then another guy tried to sucker punch him. It bounced off his head. He grabbed the guy, and I thought that he was going to make out with him. He grabbed him in the back of the head, pulled him in, and bit his nose off.
Oh, my
I said,
God.
It's time to get out. And I've heard Rock tell that story.
Rock tells the same story?
Yeah, on Jimmy Fallon. I saw it.
Oh,
Yeah,
my God.
Yeah.
So he is just as bad as they say.
Yeah, he's the baddest man on the planet.
Yeah. So I got to ask you about what happened after all this with the angle with Nancy.
Well, we had been separated for
Nancy
6
and Chris
months.
Benoit, yeah.
We were separated for 6 months. I was living in the Florida Keys at the time.
Okay.
She was living in Daytona. We knew we were going our separate ways, and I incorporated it into an angle.
And with Chris. And People say you booked your own divorce. Is that not accurate?
No. I mean, we're heading there. I was not in the house for 6 months, and we were living our own lives.
Was that a hard story for you to watch 13 years later?
What happened?
Yeah, the tragedy.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I spent a lot of nice years with her. She was a wonderful girl, and I don't think we'll ever really know what happened.
Sure. So after WCW, did you go WWE at that point? Were you backstage?
No, I was signed for 3 years, but I was signed to a contract for Turner, not for WCW. I was in the office. So when they bought it, I got paid for 3 years and went home and opened up the gym and went fishing and diving and raised the kids.
Yeah. Do you still stay active in wrestling at all?
Yeah, I go to these quite a bit. It's great to get out and see the fans, and it's a whole different experience now.
Yeah. Well, Kevin Sullivan, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. So we got Kevin Sullivan here. Love talking to Kevin. That was exciting. He had some great stuff. Before I get to it, though, I want to talk. Kevin's got a podcast out there, Taskmaster Talks with Kevin Sullivan on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Of course, he was called the Taskmaster in the Dungeon of Doom. So Taskmaster Talks with Kevin Sullivan. Go give it a listen. But a lot of good stuff in that interview. Three things of note. First, the Ming Haku story about him biting a chunk out of a guy's back in a bar fight is one of the freakiest stories I've heard. Everyone talks in the wrestling world about how tough Haku or Ming is. Well, there's one story right there. We're going to be talking to Haku in an upcoming episode, and I'm going to ask him a little about this, so you'll want to tune in for that. That'll be coming up in coming weeks. The Hulk Hogan stuff I thought was really interesting, that he would tell his kids, when you say your prayers at night, thank Hulk Hogan, for all this stuff. Because Hulk Hogan is the reason in mid-1990s why WCW made the money it did. You can talk about other things going on, Sting, the Dungeon of Doom, Ric Flair, NWO to a point, but that was kind of because of Hogan. But Hulk Hogan was the driving force from the early 90s. I think it was 94 when he showed up all the way through the NWO era. That is why guys were making money, because all eyes were on Hulk Hogan when he showed up in WCW, both as a babyface and then as an eventual heel with the NWO. So it's really interesting, his perspective, even though on camera he was Hulk Hogan's biggest nemesis. He was throwing guys at him to take out Hulkamania. Backstage in real life, he was really thankful for Hulk Hogan and what he brought to the company, particularly financially, because that's what it's all about, going and making money for a living. These wrestlers were making money because Hulk Hogan was there. Interesting perspective. And then on the Nancy Benoit stuff, Nancy Sullivan, Nancy Tofolino, I think is her original maiden name, that talking about, people have said Kevin booked his own divorce in that love triangle involving Nancy and Chris Benoit. He said that wasn't the case. Nancy and I were living separately. We knew we were going our separate ways, so he turned it into a wrestling angle. The wrestling angle did not cause the divorce, Kevin says. He says the divorce was already coming. He just did a wrestling angle out of it. He was horrified by what eventually happened with Nancy and Chris, which you can check out episode 11 going ringside right now wherever you get your podcasts. So wanted to thank Kevin for coming on the show. Really interesting guy. Just so much history. But now I want to go from one bookend in this industry to the other. From Kevin, who is a historical figure in the 70s through the 90s, to a guy who's been big in the 2000s and is still going strong today. Another guy we were excited to have on the show, and that would be Bobby Fish. Bobby Fish has been on the wrestling scene since the early 2000s. And he's been kind of all over the wrestling world. He's been in NXT, he's been Ring of Honor, AEW, has done stuff in Japan, and I think he's on the independent circuit right now, but he's one of those guys, very great worker, good on the mic, has a lot of abilities, and we were able to talk to him about what he's doing with his life right now. So before we get into that, I want to kind of talk about who Bobby Fish is, if you're not familiar. So he started in 2002. He would do a lot of territorial, regional stuff, more independent stuff, but he started kind of getting on the radar in 06 when he started doing Pro Wrestling Noah. That's a Japanese-based outfit with a pretty strong fan base, but Bobby Fish really became known, I would say, in 2012 when he got into Ring of Honor. I've talked to a lot of fans of Bobby Fish as prepared for this episode, and they would tell me, you've got to see his Ring of Honor stuff. That's where Bobby Fish was really at his peak. He was there about 5 years and did a lot there. And then he goes back to Japan. He's in New Japan doing a lot there. And Bobby Fish really became, I think, on the radar of the mainstream national fan base when he got into NXT. He showed up in NXT in 2017, was there about 4 years. I think he had the tag championship alongside his tag team partner. He feuded with Aleister Black, and he just had a good run in NXT for about 4 years. He eventually made his way to Jacksonville-based All Elite Wrestling, AEW, where we're at. Had about a year there, and he had some good feuds there with Sammy Guevara and others. He's been done some stuff with Impact now. He's on the independent circuit. He's kind of one of those guys who's a great journeyman in the industry, and at any moment could come in and be a major player in a federation or a promotion. So we caught up with Bobby Fish. He's kind of all over the place. He's on the independent circuit right now, but he's a guy who could really show up at any time, any company. He's been through all of them, really. All the main ones, from the New Japan to the AEW, Ring of Honor, NXT. He's done a lot. So here's our interview with Bobby Fish. We're excited to be joined now by NXT, AEW, world-known Bobby Fish. Bobby, talk to me about what you're doing right now.
Right now I'm watching some wrestling. I got my table set up here. Signing some autographs, meeting some people, just enjoying a good, wholesome wrestling vibe. Like, it's just, this is the grassroots kind of stuff. And, this is the lifeline of what we know as modern day pro wrestling.
What was your jump to go from this to being nationally known?
My first break was a company in Japan called Pro Wrestling Noah, and then Ring of Honor, New Japan Pro Wrestling, eventually WWE when I worked with NXT, and then on to AEW. I've really had, pretty much everything I could have asked for in my career, and it was just persistence, really.
What was NXT like? Any fun memories of NXT?
Oh, God, yeah. I mean, the takeovers were electric. Those were the pay-per-views that we had at the time. And I think with my time spent in this industry, there's pockets, windows of time that are exceptional, but nothing lasts forever, right? So everything that's good does eventually come to an end. There was a moment in time where NXT was, it was just hitting on all cylinders, and it's some of the fondest memories of my career.
So we, in our city here, had Tony Khan start AEW.
Yes,
you were
sir.
part of AEW. What was AEW like?
AEW was a breath of fresh air, to be honest. It was this, startup company. These weren't people that had been doing this, for decades. It was a new thing. Nobody really knew where it was going to go. The founders of it, outside of Tony, but the boys, the Matt and the Nick Jacksons, the Cody Rhodes, the Hangman Page, those guys, they were really just like almost outlaws. And I think there's something cool about that. I think Tony Khan saw that and said, okay, I can get behind that. And my hat's off to all of them because they're just doing great stuff.
Favorite feuds for you? Favorite guys you've competed with?
Whole career? Matt and Nick are definitely up there. The Young Bucks. Yeah. Kyle and myself as Red Dragon, that was really a good time. Any of the War Games matches that we did in NXT, I'm very fond of. The Undisputed Era, we couldn't have hoped for a better combination coming into the company. So I was actually waiting for somebody to tell me it was a rib, and they were just teasing us when they put us together. And it really just, it was like not going to work anymore. It was somebody paid me to hang out with my friends.
Were you surprised how well NXT did? Because it had been Raw and SmackDown for so long, and then NXT just comes out of nowhere and shocks the world.
I wasn't shocked because at that time, coming from Ring of Honor in New Japan, I would say that New Japan in years previous to that was like the critically acclaimed stuff. And then I watched as NXT started to take that spot. And so you had Finn Balor come into NXT and leave in New Japan. You had Kevin Steen, Kevin Owens. You had Sami Zayn. You had these guys. You had Shinsuke end up in this place NXT that nobody thought they would because it was WWE. So to have them there, it was like, wow, this is the place to be. And the takeovers were just the right amount. It was, packed arenas, well-told stories, and maybe 7 matches. It wasn't overkill. It was a beautiful thing. And like I said, just a window in the history of the business that I think will, it will age well.
If our viewers want to follow you, what's the best way to do it?
I have a podcast called The Undisputed Podcast with Bobby Fish. Our video portion is on Premier Streaming Network, owned by Freddie Prinze Jr. and some others. I am also BobbyFishApparel.com is my merchandise website. The Bobby Fish on Instagram, The Bobby Fish on Twitter, and all the stuff.
The Bobby Fish. Yes, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate it. We got Bobby Fish here. Right there at the end. I really want to thank Bobby for coming on. We think he's going to be back here in Florida in coming months, so we hope to catch up with him again. But a lot of fun talking to him. The Undisputed Podcast with Bobby Fish. Premier Networks has it, so maybe give it a check out at some point. So we're really excited to have Bobby on. He is one of those guys, great perspective. I liked what he said about AEW and the founding of it. It was almost like you had these outlaw wrestlers, and Kenny Omega, the Young Bucks, Cody Rhodes at the time, and Tony Khan saw that and decided we could start something. So really interesting there in talking about those real glory days of NXT when he was in it with the takeovers, war games, just so much fun there. Bobby Fish, just a guy who has done it all. He said he's accomplished all his dreams, and he's still a relatively young guy and probably will be doing a lot more. But he's on the independent circuit right now. So we're so excited to talk to both these guys today on the show, both Kevin Sullivan, Bobby Fish. An exciting show. We're excited to have both guests on today. So we thank you for joining us today. Once again, please keep spreading the word about this show right here, Going Ringside. Let your friends and family know that it's out here. Wrestling groups, you cannot share it enough. We really want to keep getting the word out there. And give us a follow at Going Ringside on both TikTok and Instagram, where we're putting exclusive content every day. So thanks again for joining us on another episode of Going Ringside.
This has been Going Ringside with The Local Station, brought to you every Wednesday on your favorite podcast player, on News4Jax Plus, as well as the News4Jax YouTube channel.